child. It is not a Muslim child or a Catholic child. It is a child of Muslim parents or a child of Catholic parents. This child is too young to know what it thinks about the universe, about morality, and so on. So it is actually evil to label a child with the religion of its parents. What you should be doing is not... We should never indoctrinate children with the beliefs of their parents. We should teach children to think for themselves. They may be too young to actually take in all the evidence, but at least the child should be taught to ask, what is the evidence, or is there evidence for this? If the child asks why I have to believe such and such, the wrong answer is, well, that's because our people have always believed that. That's the wrong answer. The right answer is, well, here's the evidence, or you may be a little bit too young to understand the evidence, but the evidence is there, and when you're a bit older, you will be able to look up the evidence. But never ever say to a child, well, that's just tradition, that's what we believe, that's what our elders say, that's what our holy books say, and you have to have faith. That's wicked.
We're now going to open up the questions to the audience, and remember, it's questions we want and not comments and life histories. So, we'll have, if you can raise your hand, there's a gentleman here, please stand up over there in the center. Yes, there you go, right over there. Okay. There's a gentleman over there, standing there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Professor Dawkins, thank you for that very bracing session. One of the enduring arguments which is used in favour of religion of all sorts is that people somehow, humans, are not capable of making proper moral decisions. So we may have debunked all the creation arguments, but somehow people need to have some moral guidance, preferably underpinned with threats of eternal damnation and so on. Otherwise, they won't ever do the right thing. Could you comment on that, that approach?
I'm sure you would agree with me that is an astonishingly condescending and patronising view of humanity. That the only way that people can be good is because they're bribed to be good by the promise of celestial bliss, or they're threatened with the promise of celestial torture going on forever, according to certain religions. So it's a very ignoble reason for being good. But then it's worse than that, because when you think about what the standards of goodness are in at least the holy books that I'm familiar with, they're horrible. You wouldn't wish to know anybody who based their moral values on the Judeo-Christian Bible or the Islamic Quran for a start. I mean, that would be an awful thing to base your morals on, and thank goodness we don't anymore. Because if you notice, when you challenge a religious person about something like stoning adulteresses to death or something, they say, oh, we don't do that anymore. Well, of course we don't do that anymore. That's because we've moved on. And the only way you can justify that on biblical grounds is to cherry pick. You choose those verses of your holy book which fit in with the modern, liberal, decent consensus which we all share, whether we're religious or not, and which clearly does not come from any holy book, because we would have to have some criterion for doing the cherry picking. And that criterion cannot possibly be internal to the holy book. It's obviously got to come from elsewhere, and it's difficult to know exactly where it does come from, but what we can say is that people in the 21st century have a consensus of what is good and what's bad, which is very different from the consensus that people had, for example, in the 18th century. Very different indeed. And that change has come about for non-religious reasons. So I earnestly hope that nobody actually bases their morals on anything, on any kind of holy book. And as a matter of fact, I think the evidence is that they don't.
Go ahead.
Dr. Dawkins, I've heard you speak several times on interviews, and you've been quite critical, as you are again, on many religions. But I've not heard you ever speak badly of a religion like Buddhism. My question is, do you actually see Buddhism as a religion, or just what your opinions are?
Well, I'm at a disadvantage, especially in Sri Lanka, in that I know very little about Buddhism, and no doubt I can be enlightened about that. My small understanding, such as it is that there are different varieties of Buddhism, and some of them are actually not so much religions as ways of life, as rules for living, and I could imagine that might be rather good, and I know little enough about it. So to the extent that a variety of Buddhism refrains from supernatural magic, I might well be sympathetic towards it. But I don't know enough about it, I'm sorry to say.
This gentleman over here, white hair, I'm sorry to identify you that way. But just over here, please, Mike, please. Over there.
I enjoyed very much listening to you, thank you very much. You got me worried on one point. That is, there may be fish out in the sea right now who are my great cousins. And I'm here on land, stuck in this hole. And also, is there a DNA connectivity between my great cousins and myself? Because in which case, I might have to do a DNA test before I eat a fish. I don't eat my own. If that is not the case, when do I lose my DNA connectivity? At what point? Thank you.
Well, the fish in the sea are your very, very distant cousins. They're your 185 million cousin. So when you eat a fish, you are indeed eating a cousin. And when you eat a cow, you're eating a much closer cousin. So yes, I mean all living creatures are cousins of each other. We all share a common ancestor, and the evidence for this is extremely strong. It is that the DNA code, which not just all animals, but all plants or fungi or bacteria share, it is identical, all but identical. And so this is the machine code of life, the code by which DNA letters in triplets are translated into action, which as far as we can see is an arbitrary code, is universal, and this must mean that we are all descended from the same common ancestor, a rather remote common ancestor in the case of bacteria, a rather more recent common ancestor in the case of fish, and a very much more recent ancestor in the case of chimpanzees. So yes, we are all cousins. This is not something that should worry you, I don't think. I think it somehow brings us all together.
My question is still on fish, but whales. Recently I discovered that the whales transmit to outer space, in fact Challenger, and people picked up their frequency. And my son asked me a very difficult question recently: who are they talking to, the whales?
Well, whales do have a very complicated set of a very complicated vocal repertoire, and I recommend, if you get a chance, to listen to recordings made by Roger Payne, the great whale expert of humpback whales. It is a most eerily beautiful sound, ranging in frequency from deep, deep subsonic to ultrasonic. It's a very, very wide range of frequencies, and their songs, and they probably could be called songs in the same way as birds' song, their songs repeat after a period of minutes. So it's a very, very complicated song, which then repeats word for word, so to speak, at the end of this cycle of several minutes. They are singing to each other. They're singing to each other for the same kind of reason, probably, as birds sing to each other, maybe attracting a mate. I don't know what the details are. I'm not sure that it is known. They're not talking to us. They're talking to each other. The toothed whales, as opposed to the baleen whales, toothed whales like sperm whales and like dolphins, and narwhals and killer whales. The toothed whales have a totally different kind of use for their sound, which is echolocation. They're using echoes from their sounds to find their way around, to find their prey, and so on, which is what bats also do, and two independent families of birds also do. So in total darkness, in the deep sea, or in very muddy water, as in very muddy rivers, dolphins, whales, use echoes from their own cries in order to find their way around. And the detail with which they can do this is such that it's comparable to what we can do with our eyes. And so we can conjecture that what the whales are doing is building up in their brains a mental picture of the world around them, using only sound, only echoes. And that mental picture may be very similar to the mental picture that we build up using light entering our eyes. I think that's a wonderful thought.
Hello.
Gentleman at the back there.
Yes. Shall I?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Richard Dawkins. I'm Sri Lankan, and thank you very much for coming to Sri Lanka and inspiring us all. And my question is, of course, sexuality. When it comes to human sexuality, religion has a great control by way of ethics and how should you behave and all. And where would you stand with science and evolution? Of course, I'm a believer there. What we should say in the modern generation to guide their sexuality according to science?
Well, I'm not sure that it's the business of a scientist to guide. From a Darwinian point of view, sexuality is all about reproduction, and that's what it's there for, and all the details of our evolution of sexuality can be interpreted in that light. However, we've moved on rather from our Darwinian roots, and in just the same way as we have all sorts of practices which have rather little to do with our evolutionary past, like the practice of music and art and poetry and science indeed, where these are not obviously geared towards propagating our selfish genes. And sexuality also has been emancipated, if we wished to emancipate it, from its original function of reproduction. And so sexuality too can flower in the sorts of ways that literature and art flower, and emancipate itself from its evolutionary roots. And of course that's what's happened. Whenever anybody uses contraception, they're using sex for a purpose other than the original biological one. And similarly, the wide variety of people's sexual preferences, homosexuality and so on. Again, this is not very Darwinian, but it's what people like, and so it's another aspect of freedom which we must have.
I'm afraid we are out of time for questions, but I just have time for just one more, and I'd love to hear from a young person. So does anybody young?
Well, here's a young and born person.
All right, that's it. Go ahead.
Yeah. Professor Dawkins, you suggested that all people or all animals and plants are interconnected.
Sorry.
You suggested that all plants, animals and things are interconnected. Is it not possible for each individual species to have evolved in a natural environment, mutually exclusive of each other, rather than being interconnected? Well, is that not a possibility?
But by interconnected, you mean, I think, sharing a common ancestor.
Yes.
And I think the evidence, as I said before, from the commonality of the DNA code is so overwhelming that it's simply inconceivable that they could have evolved independently. It would be very exciting if somebody could discover a life form, say something that looks a bit like a bacterium, which has a totally different genetic code. That would be a wonderful revelation. And actually the physicist Paul Davies is looking for that. He says it's too difficult and too expensive to go to other planets to look for life. What about looking to see if there's another life form that doesn't share the DNA code with us? And maybe there is. It's rather like the principle of the chap who lost his keys and was looking for his keys under the lamppost. And somebody said to him, "Why are you looking for your keys under the lamppost? Did you lose them here?" He said, "No, I didn't lose them here, but this is where the light is." and that's what Paul Davies is doing. It's too difficult to get to other planets. So although the chances of finding another life form on this planet may be rather low, you think they're rather high, then we might as well look for it here, and that's what he's doing, and I wish him luck.
Thank you very much, Professor Dawkins.